Button. Okay, so welcome to the first edition of the CHAOSS Funding Impact Measurement Working Group on February 2nd, 2025. We are under the CHAOSS Code of Conduct, so please keep that in mind and be kind to each other. So our CHAOSS question of the day is what brings you to this meetup. So this is a good way for us to get a sense for kind of why people are here. And so we've got quite a diverse group of interests there. So I would encourage you as new people join to go ahead and add your name there and fill this out. That would be great. So with that, so a lot of this, so the idea for this working group actually came from Kaylin as a result of some of the work that we've been doing with Paul and Mirko on funding, including a paper on this for OFA. So maybe we'll just turn it over to you, and you can, Kaylin, and you can talk about the background, the objectives, and drive the rest of the agenda if you don't mind doing that.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Don. Hi, everyone. My name's Kaylin Osborne. Firstly, apologies from Mirko Boom, who is on holiday in Portugal right now. So yeah, he can't make it. But basically the brief history behind this is that Mirko and I, as you know, Linux Foundation Europe folks, are involved in the NGI Commons, which, if you've not heard of the NGI Commons, is a initiative run by the European Commission involving various organizations. And what we're doing over the next 2 years, or remaining over the next 2 years, is evaluating digital commons policy making and funding that has taken place at the European Commission level, but also across Europe, with the aim of proposing strategic recommendations to how the European Commission and more broadly the European community can support the digital commons. And in that initiative, Mirko and I are leading a task which concerns the measurement of the impacts of the funding programs by the NGI, which to date come to almost 200 million euros in funding for development of new technologies that match, which should be released as open source technologies, but not all are, that are aligned with European values. And so we've been working on this since last year, and had run certain workshops, events, conversations about how to do this in a proper and meaningful way. And thankfully, it turns out we're not the only ones struggling with this question. So among other people, we spoke with Paul, who's here, and basically we met up in Berlin and just used a whiteboard and wrote down all the kind of problems that we're working on, and found a lot of overlaps. And we agreed that it would make sense to kind of organize our learnings so far, um, and maybe develop some common recommendations in a paper. And that's when Paul had the wonderful idea of roping in Don, because Paul explained that Don was also interested in these questions. So that's the background behind the paper. Um, Paul, feel free to jump in if I've missed any key details.
No, you're good.
Okay, awesome. But I
Yeah,
guess
keep going.
important detail is that what we're trying to do at the NGI is quite different to what Paul's trying to do at SDA, which is, the NGI is funding the development of new technologies. So we're currently working on on an initial sample of six projects with where one project is at each layer of like an internet stack, from operating systems to applications. And the NGI has, for these various projects have received between 1 and 4 grants from the NGI in the last 5 years, which mostly concern, development of new features or new protocols for existing projects. But the NGI, so that's our sample, but the NGI kind of portfolio of funded projects also includes completely new projects, like prototypes that were developed. Whereas Paul is concerned with measuring the impact of funding for maintenance and security work, which is the main focus of the STF and SCA. And the considerations there are a bit different Paul, can I put you on the spot and maybe to get ask
Yeah,
you to elaborate
happily.
on how your considerations are different from ours?
Yeah, so as Killian was saying, we're largely looking at uh, long-standing, prevalent open source projects that lots of different technological stacks rely on. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold, FOSDEM flu still, so I'll take it slow. Um, but what we share, I guess, in common is a need to justify the use of taxpayers' money. And as we're a publicly funded organization, we have a degree of accountability there and need to come up with a way of sort of measuring sensitively, sensibly, the impact that we're having on open source projects and communities. And I think one thing, speculating slightly, one thing that's a sort of shared interest and shared understanding is trying to acknowledge and be sensitive to the kind of human realities behind the open source projects, be they new innovations or existing ones that need funding to do maintenance work. And I think that's certainly kind of informed our approach. Um, yeah, so whilst we have different goals on some level, I think it's not unreasonable to say that the sort of the general approach to uh, looking at and understanding open source software projects is one that we share. And I think like Dawn's work and say others in the CHAOSS community, such as Sean and Matt, have been a real linchpin in informing that. So that's kind of how we found common ground, I would say.
Absolutely. And then, so in November, we presented the toolkit, which is basically, the as I say, the product of the conversations and thinking that we all had since, since the summer. But it's not the finished product, we saw it as, a means towards an end, and the end is mobilizing people with similar concerns, whether these are, intellectual concerns or very practical concerns to your, these are things you work on. Um, and we think, at the OFA symposium, we noticed that there are a lot of people with an interest in this. And then that after the symposium in November, we had a lot of ad hoc conversations. And then so that I suggested to Paul and Dawn that we set up a working group where we can have these conversations openly and collectively rather than having kind of private conversations. And in the last year we've done a lot of talking, and it's not that we want to stop. We don't want to stop talking. It's important to share ideas, share feedback, but we really, or at least Paul and I, at the stage with our respective work at the NGI and STF, we need to move into doing and actually measuring the impacts and producing evidence of what the positive or negative impacts of the funding has been. So one of the main objectives of this working group is to develop frameworks and metrics for measuring the impacts of funding. Um, and, along with that, creating guidelines and tools that we can use as evaluators of funding, but also maybe that funders and projects can use themselves. Paul is in a different position as I am because Paul actually works for a funder, whereas I don't. We're contracted by a funder. Um, and whilst doing all of this, we want to, document and share best practices across different project types and different funding models. And yeah, ultimately, you have this as an open space where it's not just Paul and I and Dawn doing this because we started this, but creating, a balanced and kind of decentralized community where everyone feels like they can participate and share what they're working on and any kind of tools that they think would be useful. So I think I'll leave it there with objectives and background. Does anyone have any questions about that before we move on to the next agenda item? Okay. So the next agenda item is actually to review the objectives as a group. Um, so maybe this is a good segue. See the screen is shared. So um, let me see the chat. Okay. Don, are you okay with taking notes? I'm not sure I can jump in with the notes while I.
Yeah, I'll help with the notes, but usually we do it collaboratively, so the person speaking isn't taking the notes. So I'm hoping that others on the call can help chime in with some of the
Yeah,
notes.
yeah.
I don't type very fast.
Okay.
Oh, I will try to help. I just have to silence myself
thanks,
because I
Todd.
have a clicky keyboard.
Thank you.
And also, Paul, if you want to chair or drive this meeting, you're welcome to. I don't want to be selfish here.
Feel free to be selfish. I'm still, as I said, just, suffering from a cold.
Okay.
So feel free.
So perhaps we can. I mentioned many of the objectives in the background, but maybe we can just go through them line by line. If you click on the GitHub repo link, you'll see them written as well. But this is what we see here in the Google Doc is the full list as we have them. So the first one is develop standardized frameworks and metrics for measuring economic, social, and technological impacts for open source funding. Do we have any kind of comments or questions about this objective?
I don't want
Sean?
to. Sorry, Sean.
Go ahead, Paul.
It was just partly just, I guess, a kind of question of sort of our process, but and perhaps it's also useful for context, Gillian, is to say that some of the work towards sketching out these frameworks we've done in the paper, and not suggesting this is kind of required reading, but perhaps if we had some kind of documentation of what we think would be useful reading in the group itself, I think that could help, because that paper itself is informed by the work of people who are themselves in this group. So I'd also like to see this space as somewhere where we can share sort of, prior work from other people, and sort of create a bit of a knowledge base as well. I know that sort of is springing out of the frame of this objective itself, but just seeing where it could fit.
I guess maybe that would fit under document and share best practices. It's not exactly that. So maybe we can just add it as a separate objective,
Yeah.
develop a knowledge base. I really like that idea. Do you have any suggestions of what the best platform would be for sharing that? Would it just be like a Google Sheet or like a Google Doc?
Yeah, Google Doc, or even just linking perhaps in the repo, possibly. I just think, like, because I came, just to give a bit of context, I came to this question not too long ago. Like, I've only been sort of dealing with this professionally, sort of in the last year and a half. And I think there's so much work out there that could be drawn together. And I'm thinking of really kind of fundamental documents like, say, Julia Ferroli and others, beyond the repo. I think that's a fantastic place to start when we start thinking about, open source communities and how to sort of sensitively look at them, as it were, and study them.
Now, Sean, you had your hand up earlier. Did we address your question or did you still have one?
I think I provided anything that I wanted to at the time. We're good.
Okay, cool. Gerardo, you've got your hand up.
So I ask you to reduce usage of Google Docs as much as possible, as friendly they are to work with and collaborative, and for those that are moving away from closed platforms, it's pain in the neck. I would propose that we use repos whenever we're trying to make arguments or discuss subjects, issues. I, for myself, have some 500 or something references in, what's it called? Zotero library, which I could make open to the group, which needs some caretaking because this is piling up all these references. And they are also a good way of keeping references of papers and other documents in a sort of well, more arranged fashion. As for a working document, that's okay, but try not to abuse the Google Docs, please.
So for the
I
Zotero, is
know
that
CHAOSS
something?
is very much Google Docs based, but it's becoming to be a little bit awkward these last days.
Did you have something to add, Sean?
I was going to ask for the Zotero. I think certainly shared reference library. I found these useful from time to time. Zotero's limitations with them notwithstanding. I
Okay,
don't know if
I'll
everyone wants
open
to
one.
share their own if they have them, or if we want to create our own for this group. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe we start with a markdown file in the repo and we can link to some of the Zotero
Sure.
collections that people have as a start. And then if we decide we need to spin up our own, we could do that. But that seems like maybe we start with collecting a list. Oh, sorry, Kaylin, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I like that idea, Gerardo. I just want to make a distinction between like a Zotero library and a knowledge base. Like I think having all our references together in one place was something we should definitely do. But for me, a knowledge base, at least how I've understood it, as when you suggested, Paul, is something that, you know, like a Zotero folder or library can be a bit overwhelming, right? If they're like 500 references, you don't really know where to start. Whereas we could maintain a document, which is, I guess, this guidance, which helps newcomers or, practitioners, um, you know, understand that Zotero, that all that knowledge or that information that is all those 500 rows in that Zotero library. Um, so yeah, turning those data points actually into knowledge. So I'm not really sure off the top of my head how we would do that, but um, yeah, I would need to sit down and think about how to like structure that kind of guidance. But I think we should do that in addition to having a Zotero library. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think what we can do is we can structure this markdown file in a way that it's, maybe our top 10 recommended readings, sort of the getting started things. So things like the Beyond Repository, the OFA paper. Um, and then I think we could also have an additional links section where people can add Zotero libraries, additional references, all the other stuff that we want to kind of keep track of, but make sure that that doesn't get mingled with the getting started sort of top 10 things that you should read list. I think if we structure the markdown file, all right, we can probably figure that out. I don't know, Sean, Gerardo, if you have any other thoughts on
I,
that.
I've dumped reading lists to Markdown. I do this for my classes all the time out of Zotero. So I mean, Zotero does make it pretty easy to create something that's more generally accessible to people who may not be Zotero users. Um, there's also a plugin for WordPress where you can actually create, use your Zotero library and have it published automatically to the web if we ever wanted to employ anything like that. But that's like 12 steps ahead right now.
Yeah, perhaps jumping in, I think for the sake of moving through to the other objectives, like perhaps if we take this general idea of saying, okay, what's the sort of not exactly required reading, but like the sort of core fundamental texts or pieces of work in this space, and trying to give that some shape, because I think it's also really useful for people approaching this question to then kind of inform themselves and learn a bit more about this topic. And I think there are people in this group who almost certainly can add stuff that I would find really fascinating and useful. But I don't know necessarily if we need to sort of settle on an approach just yet. Sorry, it feels like slightly like with that suggestion of what's the word? exploded the frame of the agenda. But I'd be happy to move on to the next point, I guess.
Yeah, let's do that.
The next one is relevant to what we've just been discussing, right? So create
Yeah.
guidelines to help funders and open source projects evaluate funding outcomes. Um, the thing that I wonder if we should edit here is the specific stakeholders that are mentioned here. So for example, I know I feel excluded because I am not a funder, nor am I an open source project. Um, so
Get out
maybe
your wallet.
well, I made micro donations to some projects I
Yeah.
like. No, but here I'm talking about, I guess maybe this is just very pedantic, but just widening the scope to include, researchers. Sorry for being pedantic here, but I just beyond myself, this is not a selfish point, but like I don't know if a newcomer comes and sees this and says, okay, well, I'm not a funder nor an open source project. Um, this is not for me, but I want to create guidelines. Where do I go? So I just want to make sure that those kind of folks feel like they can get involved.
Well, and my experience with funders is if we can help them see measures of impact that we think matter, they welcome that kind of insight, because the funders I've talked to outside of this call are all trying to figure out the best way to assess impact. It is a substantial problem across a lot of categories of open source, I think. So I guess I'm saying this can be an iterative process, and that if we're helping funders, we're actually helping the whole cause.
Yeah, I agree. Mike, do you want to elaborate on your comment?
Um, I was just agreeing with you largely. I mean, certainly funders and open source projects are like probably two of the first groups I would think of when it comes to open source funding. But then you also have things like Linux Foundation and various sorts of advocacy bodies. You have political parties. You have just individuals that are impacted by open source software in some way. Um, and all of these people both impact open source funding and are impacted by it, as well as you said, like researchers and other folks.
I actually wonder if we want to rewrite this objective and just honestly just remove this bit, create guidelines and tools to help evaluate funding outcomes. Because I think this is something that if we try to list all the stakeholders, we're going to be here for a year. But I totally agree that funders way more than just funders and open source projects.
Yeah, that's a very clean solution. Um, okay, if we have no more comments on this, we can move on to the next one, which is about documenting and sharing best practices. And so one thing I personally see doing here is, as and my colleague Adrian, I don't know if Adrian is on the call. Adrian, are you here yet? Oh
Yes,
yeah, I see.
here.
You want to
Sorry.
say hi? Can you
Hi,
introduce yourself?
yes, I made a quick note, but sorry I joined late. I'm a colleague of Kalian from the LF and was always really interested in the ecosystem funding and this whole space. So it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So Adrian and I are going to be going through these 6 case studies I mentioned earlier, um, and be figuring out like we're starting with exploratory interviews and planning to complement that with quantitative analysis. But I think one thing we're looking forward to doing is sharing our progress and kind of the questions that we're working on and seeing if other people are working on similar questions or facing similar problems. And then through that kind of dialogue, develop best practices. I hesitate to call them best practices at the beginning because I don't think we're starting with best practices, but our goal is to create best practices through dialogue and collaboration here. So that's like basic, I guess that's I'm talking about an activity here, but like that is an activity that would help us kind of implement.
And we lost
Oh, okay. I was like,
Kalen.
I was looking for my computer. Did my computer break? No. Okay, Kaylin went away.
Kalen went
Sorry,
away.
Kaylin.
Okay. Yeah, he's I think joining us from someone's house in Scotland somewhere. So hopefully he'll be back. I don't know, do we wanna is there more we want to talk about this next objective, the sharing best practices across different project types and funding models? Any
Sounds like
other?
we can move on.
Okay. So the next objective is I don't know, Paul, if you want to cover this one.
Yeah, happily. So the next objective is build an evidence base of effective funding approaches for different contexts or needs. I think certainly one that applies here, and Serkan mentioned it in the chat, would be, and it informs my work as well, would be the kind of publicly funded or policy making sort of approach. Those kind of questions of justifying, say, sort of the ROI, as it were, and different ways we could think about ROI. Again, maybe don't need to get into too much detail. Another thing that also occurs to me, and I think this could be an interesting sub point from this, is thinking about how we can kind of communicate those impacts, and it ties into those different contexts or needs, because inevitably, if you're communicating with policymakers, they won't necessarily understand even sort of the logic of version control software or Git or GitHub or whatever. And yet, you need to put this in language that they can understand. So that kind of nuance, I think, could be kind of helpful here, like what sort of audience we're looking at, I guess. Does anyone have any other points or anything that we want to kind of flesh out on this goal?
Yeah, I have. Sorry, I'm back. My Zoom crashed. I'm sorry. And I'm not sure if there's a discussion about the previous point, but maybe we can get that in a second. A question I have is how would this evidence base be different to the knowledge base that we're creating? So the knowledge base is basically a collection of prior work, and then this evidence base is, I guess, the evidence we'll be creating. But why do they have to be separate things? Does that make sense?
Sure. I don't know who added build an evidence base
I think it was me,
as a
but
goal.
now I'm
Oh, it was goal.
reflecting.
Well, I mean, one thought that occurs to me is that we can take sort of examples or use cases, as it were. I mean, this is maybe something we would get towards and perhaps work towards down the line, but I guess illustrative case studies of individual projects that have received funding for a given objective, and then illustrating how that was then measured. And it needn't be too many, but you could have these kind of compelling instances of different approaches, say different sequential takes, or quantitative versus qualitative and mixed methods, whatever, to show how it could be done depending on both the needs of the project, the needs of the organization doing the measurement, and the outcomes of the funding, I guess.
Yeah, I think examples are really powerful, to be honest. I think a lot of us, if we can see some examples of how other people have done things, even if our context is very different, I think a lot of times it helps you think about things in a way that you might not have come up with on your own, or maybe ways to frame the discussion, ways to organize it, ways to communicate it. So I really love the idea of having kind of a examples. And I do see that as kind of different. Like the knowledge base to me feels like, like recommended reading, articles, papers, things like that. And this would be more of examples and case studies. If we decide later that they aren't really two objectives, we can always combine them at some point. Any more thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I have a thought, but I think this is related to like first activities, and it's a half-baked thought, but I wonder what you will think about this, which is like a slide series where this is an arbitrary number, but let's say for a given paper which we find to be like a really essential reading or an effective funding model that we find to be effective for some context or some reason, have like a short slide deck. It could be like 3 slides, like problem, solution, out, like learning, key learning. And then like I'd be happy to like spare this. And then like at the beginning of like future meetings, just go over like these 3 slides. And then these slides would be available via the repo. So and they'd be cumulative. So like each week we'll be adding like 3 new slides. So we can use that as a resource. Others can also use it. So that would be a part of the evidence base that I think would be quite neat.
Yeah. Henrietta, you've got your hand up.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I just want to add on to what was said about the slide series. One of the things I picked up from my dealings in the UN space is always when it comes to funding is sustainability. So if we can add to that slide series, maybe just not just key learnings and the solution of problem, but then the sustainability plan for it, not necessarily like an entire, document on such, but then what was the intention of whoever implemented that project or program, etc., from the funding? What was their sustainability plan or goal? Yeah, so that we can always have that at the back of our minds when it comes to impact. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, thank you, Henrietta.
Okay, I will mention because some of you aren't always on CHAOSS calls, so we end all of our calls at 10 till the hour, so we've got about 15 more minutes. So let's keep powering through the objectives so that we can get to the discussion of first activities.
Yeah. So the next one is foster collaboration between researchers, practitioners, and funders. I think it's kind of like an obvious one. I'm not sure if we have much to say. It's kind of part of everything else, like all the other objectives. So I'm not sure if we need to state this, but maybe it's helpful just like to make it clear. Does anyone have any comments about this? Okay, no. So then the last one is contribute to broader discussions about sustaining critical open source infrastructure. It's clear to me. Do we have any comments on that?
Mike.
I guess more of a question. This is worded pretty sort of like we will provide some research outputs and people can make their own choices. The flip side of that is it comes off to me that like this group isn't necessarily advocating for any one particular solution or anything like that, which, for sure has its benefits, but I'd be curious if other folks like view advocacy towards what we think, helps people as part of the mission of this group or not, or do we want to try to stay as this, so-called objective third party? So that's just sort of my question to the group off of this one.
So maybe let's answer that question and then maybe go to Serkan, unless yours is an answer to the question. Looks like no. Okay. Paul, did you have an answer to the question? Is that why you raised your hand? Or did you have a new point?
Yeah, I did. I think Mike raises a really interesting point kind of implicitly, which is there are probably kind of harmful ways in which you could measure impact, right? You could create sort of KPIs that sort of create the wrong incentives for projects or sort of even mislocate, as it were, the kind of the impact of funding. And I guess that also touches on the point that Johan was making in the chat earlier about sort of the causal complexity. So I think we'll probably learn this by doing, right? And through exactly these discussions. But I think there is, to some degree, a kind of advocacy component about what we're doing here, which is to say, there's a wide spectrum of approaches to this question of measuring impact. Some of them necessarily are going to be, easier for, say, policymakers to digest. Some of them are going to create undue pressures on open source projects, and some of them, on some level, are probably going to be fundamentally kind of wrong, I guess. I think teasing that out and talking it through and saying ultimately maybe, where we come down on the side of these questions of, how do you measure this in a sort of sensible way is going to be a component of this group. But yeah, that will come out through the discussion, I guess. But I think it's something to be aware of, like that there will be sort of methods of approaching this question that will be inherently biased or misrepresentative. But this is precisely the space to explore them, I think.
If I can just add to what Paul said, it's a really interesting question, Mike, and I think the first idea or thought I had is that we want this to be a space where people with different views come together to develop best practices. So I worry that if we start advocating for certain ways something has to be done, we could be excluding other folks who disagree, and for maybe reasonably or unreasonably. But I personally want this to be a space where we can have those debates, and I guess the advocacy we can do is by developing an evidence base of what we found, or what previous researchers have found to be effective or ineffective or even harmful approaches. And so I guess, but it would be nice, I guess maybe this is a different objective, but become like trusted leaders in this conversation by creating this evidence base and creating this kind of neutral space where people can come and debate these things. I'm just conscious of time. I think Serkan, Henrietta, and then Johan. But remember, we still need to discuss next activities in the next 8 minutes. So please be brief. Serkan, please.
So very quickly.
Actually, I wrote it in the chat that rather than just limiting ourselves to financing critical open source infrastructure, can we also extend it in a way that our goal is to increase open source software production, and then also maybe best practices around funders, let's say. So yeah, maybe it's kind of wording, but sustaining is only feels like that, okay, there's a existing open source software pool. If we can help them out, the problem is okay, while actually we can maybe think of increasing the open source software production.
I think that's a fair point.
Yeah.
So I think very quickly, I just want to agree that we should remain neutral, especially at the beginning stages, so we can pull as many stakeholders together within a neutral environment. Then maybe later on, we can have like a subgroup that can advocate for, these like best practice actually be like implemented on all levels. But for the beginning, for now, it's always good that we maintain our neutrality. Thank you.
Great. So Don, question for you. What is normally the process? Oh, sorry, Serkan, your hand is still up. Is that a legacy hand or? Okay. Don, what is the process for editing the objectives based on this discussion and then updating the GitHub repo?
Yeah, so I would say, given that this is updating the objectives, I would say one of the co-chairs should probably volunteer to do it. I don't know, Kaylin, if you just want to do
Yeah, I
it,
can do that.
and I can review it and approve the PR. I would say just do it as a PR, and we can review it, and we can continue to iterate on these. I mean, just we can continue to work on the objectives and refine them as we work through as a working group.
Yeah, that sounds great. somewhere we have 6 minutes left, so we can move on. We can, I guess, skip all of these. But we'll go to discussion of first activities, then we'll skip all the replace with your agenda items. So earlier I mentioned an idea for starting like a slide series. I can start it off for the first meeting, which is for the next meeting. And bye, Johan, thanks for coming. And whatever I do doesn't have to be the template, and you can see how people find it, and then maybe we can do a rotating thing where for each session, someone else creates one. I'm happy to do this, but I don't want to create like homework or like burdens for people. So I just want to hear what people think about that, and then after, if we have if there are no comments, it'd be great to hear other kind of ideas for first activities from you. Okay, so no comments on the slide series. Any other activities? I see below we have comments about reminders about events. Maybe we could have those as goals for, presenting our first activity, whatever it is. Okay, well, and so earlier I mentioned before my Zoom crashed that Adrian and I are actively working on trying to measure impacts of NGI funding on 6 case studies. So if others are happy to engage in a discussion of, based on our progress, we could do that. I want to be careful about this not becoming like a feedback session that serves us and doesn't serve others. So I'm not 100% sold on this idea. So I want this to be fair, but that's just an idea.
Yeah, so one of the things I'll mention is that the way the CHAOSS working groups work is that, we'll put together kind of a framework for the agenda. There will always be a replace with your agenda items option. And we really do encourage you to add your own agenda items. So if there's something interesting that your group has done around measuring the impact of funding that you want to share, if you're running into some issues and you have some questions about how to get past a particular problem that you're having measuring the impact of some funding, those are really, really great topics. And so I just want to encourage people, like we can start with some of these action items here that we've talked about for the next meeting, but I would encourage all of you to think about what else you want to talk about in the meeting, and we can add it to the agenda. I mean, I think especially at this stage within a new working group, I think that people bringing in their questions and their examples, at least for part of the agenda, is a really good use of the time, because it gets us all familiar with the different challenges that people are having, right? That maybe we can help them with, or maybe it just gives us something else to think about. So these agendas are for all of us to work on. It's not just the chairs. It's not Kaylin, Paul, and I developing the agenda, and this is what we're going to talk about. We all get to participate in this, and I really encourage that. This first agenda was a little heavy on the chairs because we wanted to go through the objectives and the reason that we're here, just to get everybody on the same page. But I think future meetings will be a lot more interactive and a lot more other people's agenda items.
I think this discussion's been really helpful to know sort of the origin story for this meeting, and to give us all ideas about how we can hijack future agendas.
Awesome. Yeah,
Well,
and the reminders at the bottom, I'll be honest, I put these in all of the meetings that I chair for the CHAOSS project, because I like for people to submit the work that we're doing within CHAOSS into conferences. So I will tend to I'll just keep adding these as conferences come up. But I will point out that deadline, it's actually something like midnight, September 17th. So the real deadline is the end of this weekend, like Sunday, for Open Source Summit North America. So that deadline is coming up in just a couple of days. So if there's stuff that we want to submit, we should be talking about that last week.
Sorry, John, I just remembered as well, we've also got FOSS Backstage coming up, where we'll also be presenting, roughly the kind of approach or the toolbox as we characterize it at FOSS stage. So perhaps also that might be a good opportunity for those who are coming to Berlin to kind of have a little side gathering or something like that. That'd be cool.
Yeah, that would be great. I'll be there for the whole event. And along those lines, Kaylin and I have a panel along with Emma Irwin, who runs the FOSS Funders program at Microsoft. And so we're gonna have a panel at the Linux Foundation Member Summit in Napa at the end of March, so right after FOSS Backstage. So that's another opportunity to learn more, and it's a panel, so you can ask questions. Should be fun. And if you want a nice trip to Brazil, the next Open Forum Academy coming up. That's a hard one. It's hard for Americans to get visas to go to Brazil. It takes a long time.
So I guess on that note, I think we've reached the end of our agenda. So thank you everyone for coming to the inaugural working group meeting. Cheryl, I
Just
see.
want to let you know that I've left some 200-something references already in Zotero. So please do visit and join into the group so I can allow you to write in. It still needs to be sorted. So that's it.
Okay,
Awesome.
thank you.
Thank you,
That
Geraldine.
link's right here in the notes.
See you.
Great.
All
Thanks,
right.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. That was
Take
a good
care,
one.
everyone.
See you in 2 weeks. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.